3, 2, 1. How to prime the TNT. Pull the connecting tube out through the hole in front of the TNT detonator box. Plug the connecting end into the hole on the bottom of the dynamite launcher, making sure it is securely attached. Now pull the TNT detonator's handle until it clicks and stays up. Press down the spring-loaded firing pin on the dynamite launcher until it clicks and stays down. For the best explosions, fan out the blast cards in your hands. I won't do it again. And place them carefully on top of the dynamite launcher and as shown below. Now you are ready to play TNT.
Pioneers are preparing an explosive device comparable with the so-called IEDs, Improvised Explosive Devices, similar to those repeatedly used in missions abroad. We are at a counter-IED training course in Stetten am Kalten Markt. Soldiers are learning the basics and practice of investigation after bomb attacks. For training purposes, a mobile phone is attached as a detonator. The mobile phone, or rather what is left of it, is to be found later by the investigators.
Warning, I am detonating. 3, 2, 1, detonation.
3 kilograms of explosive blow up.
All right, thanks. So these small fragments, literally in the case of the explosions, by means of an introduction, the first thing I showed you is this thing I got from the toy store. It's called TNT. It's a children's game. Warning, explosive, gold fever, pleasure and fun. It's a game that quite kind of glorifies the idea of the homemade explosive and blowing things up. The second thing you saw, you might have understood, this is a promotional video, rather spectacular, by the German armed forces who promote the way in which they deal with improvised explosive devices, which is now one of the most common threats in international military operations that armed forces encounter. So I just kind of put these here, and I'll give the word back to Florian. Maybe, I don't know.
I think today we want to unwrap the layers of the research project that you're planning, that you're already started conducting. So we'll start. We'll at one point arrive at video interviews you did, but maybe we want to unwrap the stages that you're planning to do.
Yeah, I think in general that what the project will try to do is to look into the use of ordinary, everyday electronic devices and other commodities in the construction of these improvised explosive devices, and does that particularly through the angle of, and the slide just already appeared just before, in the context of this concept of malevolent creativity that Jill et al. Described in this article, which was on the screen but it's no longer there. Can we have that again? Or is that complicated? Anyway, so what they argue in this article is that malevolent creativity is a creativity that takes place in the context of deliberate actions to do harm to other people, and in this context, research into these forms of creativities are usually not very well developed, because the focus is very much on the nihilistic aspects, often the kind of primitiveness, the evilness also of these technologies. Yet the relationships between these devices and everyday life in so-called peaceful circumstances is often complex and intricate. And looking at that can also teach us something about how the devices that we live with in everyday life might be intertwined with things that are not as peaceful as they might seem, or with ideologies that go straight into military developments, etc. So the project is kind of going to look at these devices through case studies, so to say. And Florian just asked, you just asked what is going to be the structure, what are we going to do in this project. Today is the launch. And in this first stage, I've been talking to several academics who are researching in the field of digital technology, media studies on the one hand, and conflict studies on the other hand, to get some initial reflections on what is actually the position of these devices and the people who make them and the practices around them in the world we live in, particularly here in the kind of, taken for granted digital consumerism in the global north. So the first stage is this. It's kind of a theoretical exploration. That's what we're going to look at today. I made a very short documentary video, which we'll look at later. The second stage will consist of artistic experimentation, and I can maybe say a bit more about this later, but I won't go into detail. Artistic experimentation with the principles of these devices, the ways they have been hacked, and maybe taking them out of the realm of violence. And this third stage of the project, I'm planning to make a short film next spring, in which I would like to place these IEDs with digital technology in the context of, and I have the book here already, Paul Virilio's can we see that? Bunker archaeology, where he basically argues the bunker is a sign of the time, not only a kind of military icon of the end of the Second World War or the mid-40s, but also a symbol of the technological status quo of culture in a much broader sense. So my hypothesis is a bit these IEDs now are a similar kind of thing as the bunker was, but in the 21st century. And the question, of course, is what actually do these IEDs tell us about the technological culture we exist in today? So the short film is kind of going to juxtapose these things. It's going to be recorded at a former World War II bunker somewhere in the southwest of the Netherlands, where the Atlantic well used to be. Yeah.
Yeah. That's... Yeah, we'll go into the video documentary later, but maybe one of the questions is, of course, why this research?
Well, I think that I think it's interesting actually. I've done the last project I did here was using an anal electrode, with which I used to control a robot. And in that work, I was very much interested in the idioms of startup culture and consumerism, particularly related to ideas of the male body and technology and stuff. When you do a project like that, the question, why would you want to research this, pops up a lot less than when you actually want to research these IEDs. And the first response I would have to it is already, it's kind of curious that the question is more prominent with these IEDs, because they're actually very, very relevant cultural artifacts. As I already said, when we think about contemporary warfare, most soldiers nowadays hardly ever see enemy combatants, but they do encounter these IEDs. They cause more than half of the casualties, so that's one thing. The other thing is that in everyday life, this is a thing that comes back time and again, but also in popular culture. So these artifacts are just very, very prominent, first of all, in all sorts of aspects. So I think that in itself would already be a reason to look at them. But for me, there's another reason as well, and that fits in with my broader project and my work that's not only about technologies of violence, but also technologies in context of waste and technologies in intimacy. That's that I would argue that most technological devices, like a phone is a very good example, when we use them in everyday life in the Netherlands here, for example, we often take their functionality for granted. We think they're just easy and whatever. But once you start to put this device in a context that was not envisaged by the people who design them, who market them, and who kind of promote them or represent them in ordinary popular culture, then you start to actually see in what ways these devices are infused with ideology and actually play a role in the way our everyday lives are shaped. So in other words, by looking at what, for example, and we'll get to that later, what this Casio watch here, the famous Casio watch, what that watch is doing, how its meanings are transformed. Once it's used for bombs, that actually tells us something not only about the realm of explosives, violence, and all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, I'm not actually primarily interested in that. What I'm interested in is what does the use in that kind of violent, kind of often nihilistic context teach us about the meanings of this device here? Like, you know, when I walk around Rotterdam with this watch, the meanings of this watch, how does that relate to each other? So this is kind of, for me, the important reason. It's like looking at everyday technologies in extreme circumstances. That's also the subtitle of my book that will come out later this year. So,
Yeah. And if you look at, there's of course, especially in the examples you just gave, there's a lot of improvisation happening around it, and it's, for me, when I started reading upon it, it's the true ideology or the idea of being a hacker, let's say.
Yeah, yes, I think there's this issue of the hacker, but I would more say the idea of, when you think about malevolent creativity or malevolent innovation, there seems to be a kind of thing now that even the word hacker used to be something that was imbued with illegal actions and stuff. It's all been co-opted within this idea of all innovation is intrinsically good. Innovation to expand productivity, to expand consumption and production, this kind of whole thing. And then innovation to solve problems through green economies and stuff. There's this idea of, and innovation is kind of intrinsically good in itself. Technological development is good in itself. And by looking at this thing, the kind of dark side, if you like, of these kind of reappropriations, innovation and stuff, it also helps us understand that this is actually an ideology that we live in and that has a lot of different potential aspects. So yeah.
Yeah, I like how you drag the dark side in it as well, because of course you've been doing a lot of research in the bigger Africa, where you see that all of these obsolete, let's say obsolete devices are being dragged into or being used for, the good, but it's really good.
Yeah. I mean, those things are connected, right? I do indeed I've done a lot of work recently that looks at, first of all, issues of waste, electronic waste. So a lot of electronic waste from Europe and other places in the global north gets transported to the global south where it's recycled. But that project then really shifted into another aspect, namely reappropriation and regeneration of devices. And in a way, they're part of this thing that I just said, right? That's also a question of what do these devices that are taken for granted here do once they enter this extreme environment or extraordinary environment of the dump site and get regenerated there. And often there it's not for malevolent purposes, but also there certain aspects of these devices are being exposed. Similarly then here, when we look at the realm of malevolent innovation, there's this other element as well, which we'll get to after the little documentary, but that's this, of course, right? It's a completely odd, if you like, but maybe it's not so odd, kid's toy that kind of glorifies the idea of blowing stuff up, and it's not the only thing that we live with. So, and I also on purpose started with this, right? Because you might say, oh, that's completely perverse, right? We're talking about IEDs here, which causes a lot of harm and misery, and it's kind of a funny program, right? We start with a little toy and blow it up, and then we see this spectacular thing made by the Bundeswehr, where they do these nice slow motion loops of these explosions, etc., etc. But I think it's exactly by looking at this perversity of it, and through an artwork, and that's the question of, well, of course, this is an art project in the end, by pushing these absurdities and these kind of radical aspects, like these toys, into the extreme, that can help us expose the actual ideological realm of it. So it's actually that, yeah. There's kind of like dwelling on the perversity in a way as well, to kind of, rather than saying like, oh my God, these that's just really, it's so nasty, these bombs, and it's kind of primitive. Why do you want to research that at all, right? And I said, no, we actually absolutely have to research it and actually push through artistic projects this kind of perversity that lies in this, right? That you actually sell toys and promote it.
Yeah, you have a couple of examples which we'll get through after the video. So
yeah.
Is it a good moment to
I think
start?
it is a good moment to watch this video. It's about 7 minutes, and there are 3 people talking, but you'll see them. They will appear.
The Military Museum in Belgrade has this pager system on display. It is not labeled as a communication device, but as a long-range explosive activator, captured from the Kosovo Liberation Army in 1999. Activating the pager would remotely set off a bomb. The brand of the device is Radio Shack, an electronics retail store in North America. How did this device travel to militias in Kosovo, I wonder?
Fight something like the United States military just by the items you find at an electronics shop, right? So what does it mean that we sell products like this? That you can go to an electronics store at an airport and find the very devices that you would use to take down commercial airliners. How many TV shows and movies actually show you in graphic detail, almost in lovingly slow motion montages of how exactly to make these products, of how to improvise these devices. And then when people actually do it, we blame them for it, as if they didn't get the idea from pop culture, or at least weren't given some instructions from pop culture. We tend to think that this is something that bad people do to good products, rather than appreciating that this is what anyone does whenever they make use of a product contrary to the intentions of the designer. The nihilistic aspect is our unwillingness to face that freedom, that possibility.
Urbanization was about pushing away death and the possibilities of death into things that are often obliterated behind the backstage. IEDs, in terms of the improvisation, brings in the perversity of death, explosion, the annihilation and decimation of flesh as part of its social imaginary, but within the sort of imperialistic dimensions of power. Certain IEDs in the social imaginary are already co-located with certain bodies of alterity, certain bodies with rucksack who wear black hoodie jackets, are already part of that social imaginary. So the flesh is already conjoined in some ways to certain aspects of how we understand IEDs, and IEDs in terms of the asymmetrical.
Ramzi Yousef, the 1993 World Trade Center bomber, passed on this design for his signature Casio Nitro bomb trigger to a neighboring inmate in a New York City prison. A Casio F91W quartz watch is used as a timer to activate the detonator. As a consequence, the iconic watch was included in a CIA characteristics list, on the basis of which wearers of the watch in Pakistan and Afghanistan were arrested on suspicion of complicity in terrorist activities.
We could see these improvised explosive devices as existing in opposition to what Lewis Mumford has termed the mega machine. The mega machine understood in this military context, can be seen as large war machines, often state-sanctioned war machines, in which disciplined bodies are combined with technological elements and very strict social codes. In recent warfare, and then with recent we mean the last few decades, we've seen a completely new tendency within the construction of these mega war machines. And this new tendencies can be described as no longer trying to control these unruly and libidinal forces of the biological bodies that constitute to a large extent the machine, but rather eliminating them altogether, replacing the biological elements altogether by technological elements. And so where the strategic war machine becomes a completely technological edifice, the improvised explosive devices become tactical appropriations of pretty everyday technologies usually, that try to disrupt and destabilize the mega war machine.
This neatly constructed piece of electronics is a trigger system for a firebomb, designed by the Provisional Irish Republican Army in the early 1990s. It seems to be constructed with components that were sold at electronics DIY shops like Maplin's and put together by a skilled and precise craftsperson. Indeed, the biographies of known Provisional IRA IED engineers suggest that these devices could be seen in the tradition of independent television and radio engineering and piracy.
If you reframe improvisation and think about it in much more critical ways, improvisation is also about the ways in which people have always been uber creative with things, to actually thought the main framing of certain technologies and take them in another direction. And there's no romance to it, but what it does tell you is technology never flows in the lines of our kind of intended use. It always flows away, and sometimes these breakages and slippages will project violence and power back onto societies.
Yeah, so that's the first launch of the 3 interviews you did. Do we want to dive right into what they unwrap what they're all addressing?
Well, I don't want to speak for them, of course, but I think maybe if we take another approach, if we look at those 3 devices that you saw in the video, right? Because what they are the 3 kind of case studies that the project starts from. They might expand, maybe stays with this. Similarly, the idea of these 3 provocations, and of course they've said more, so I'll release some videos with their complete stories in it. The 3 provocations by Nolan Gertz, Jasmin Ibrahim and Erik Kluizenberg, they are also thought of as kind of starting points for this second phase in which we're going to, and we is Arthur Elsenaar, artist based in Amsterdam, who has a background in electronics engineering and radio piracy, and Mio van Steenis in Paris, originally from Venezuela, who works a lot in digital environments around themes of technologies of violence. What we're going to do in that week in November, kind of tinkering around with the kind of principles of these case studies, will also take place in the context of those reflections. So maybe we can just go through these 3 case studies and look at those a bit. And I've got a few slides of those as well. So if we can move to the next slide, we can see that. So the first case study we have is this Casio watch, which I already showed briefly, because this object that I held up, this is actually, it was a birthday present by Arthur Elsenaar. I'll show it later again. But here we see a Casio watch. This is one of the calculator ones, really an icon of the late 80s, early 90s, that very much stood for an idea of futurity. The kind of famous watch, which is the actual case study, is the F91W watch, which is the kind of simple version. But maybe we can have a look at the next slide, which is a small promotional video from 1989, if I'm not mistaken, a commercial, TV commercial for Casio watches.
Casio, twin graph. Data bank. World. Time. Phone dialer.
Casio, watches that do more than keep time. They keep you ahead of your time.
So, watches that keep you ahead of time, Casio, where miracles never cease. This is how I remember this watch from like the kind of 1990s, and if you remember the 80s, even before that, this watch really was pretty much a kind of symbolic object, right? It kind of stood for, oh, this is a quartz watch, so it will only be 1 second off in 1,000 years. There were this sort of hyperbolic commercials around it. For me, and I think for a lot of other people, there was a kind of felt relationship between this and also the NASA space program and all that kind of stuff, right? Digital technology as a way into the future, which they clearly cash in on in this commercial as well. Yet this watch then also developed in a different direction. And if we look at the next slide, sorry, we keep going back and forth. Richard is here doing the technical side of this presentation. There we go. Here we suddenly see a very different character associated with this watch, a different set of meanings. This is a document from the Department of Defense in the US, taken from WikiLeaks, so you can see it's actually was supposed to be secret. This is a document of a Guantanamo Bay detainee. And there, if we look on the right, we see the following. Detainee was captured with a Casio model A159W watch. That's the kind of silver version of the F91W. It says there as well. The possession of a Casio F91W model watch, or the silver color version of this model, the A159W, is an indicator of Al-Qaeda training in the manufacture of improvised explosive devices, IEDs. A JTF GTMO detainee identified the Casio watch as, quote, the sign of Al-Qaeda, which uses the watch to make bombs, end quote. The Casio was known to be given to the students of Al-Qaeda bomb-making training courses in Afghanistan, etc. So here we see that this watch, on the one hand, when worn in the global north, in Western Europe, North America, kind of transformed from this kind of sign of futurity to now a kind of hipster accessory, right? It's very much trendy. If Florian or I would wear this watch, this would just be a kind of, it's kind of a style icon. Yet, when we look here, if somebody in Afghanistan or Pakistan wears this watch, and has certain other characteristic deemed suspicious, is going to be detained, or at least back then in 2000, and I think this is around 2008, 2004, something like that, because then this watch starts to mean something else. And I think this ties also into what Yasmin Ibrahim is talking about in the video, right? That these IEDs, although usually at first sight perceived as kind of independent things that are kind of crude and evil and kind of technical explosive elements, they are always already tied in or connected to certain bodies, certain people in the social imaginary that surrounds them. And I think this really shows it for me, right? This Casio watch becomes, with a certain body, an element of this IED. With certain other bodies, it is an element of a certain technological imaginary that almost seems diametrically opposed to it. Can we go to the next slide? Now here, this is an FBI document that has been released some time ago, which used to be classified. It's from 1996. This is these are the protocols of interrogations of a mobster called Greg Scarpa from New York, who was in a prison cell in New York City next to Ramzi Youssef, so the guy who designed that schematic that popped up in the documentary. And Youssef, as you can read here, but I won't expect you to read it all, Youssef actually trusted Scarpa and was passing him on the designs for these bombs because they thought they could work together. Scarpa then passed it all on to the FBI because he thought he might get a lower sentence if he would collaborate. So if we go to the next slide, we can actually see what was passed on here. So on the left, we see Ramzi Youssef's, some people even say classic or iconic Casio Nitro bomb trigger design. On the left, you see the Casio watch. You actually have to then connect some lead wires that go out that come from what is the little piezo disc loudspeaker in the watch. So then when the alarm goes off, there will be a current running through this thyristor, which is the element on the right, the C106D, which will then cause the circuit to the detonator with a 9-volt battery to be closed, after which the bomb explodes. So he actually explained this thing, and so this whole thing later on with the Casio watch becoming this characteristic of Al-Qaeda terrorists, it has its origin with this Ramzi Youssef who designed this thing. And on the right is a whole note of how to smuggle explosives into an airplane. All these things were kind of passed on in the context of this prison environment that he was in there. So then, yeah, as I showed you before, if you can go to the close-up camera, there is this small item that I got for my birthday from Arthur Elsenaar. He made this little object here, which is of course by no means a bomb. It's just a working Casio watch that he found on the street, connected to another thing he found on the street. But then like this, it suddenly becomes something that is perceived as an explosion, and that has to do with something else as well, and that connects to what Nolan Gertz talks about, right? We have such a developed imaginary of bombs through popular culture, which comes from this, right? If I've played with this, if somebody gives me this, I immediately know, oh, that's a bomb, because it's so kind of ingrained, even though it's kind of it's almost if you look at it a little more closely, it's kind of a caricature almost, if you like. So that's this Casio that kind of brings these two stories of the same object to the forefront. And there's two other devices that popped up. So if we go back to the PowerPoint again, there is this pager system from Radio Shack, which is a shop that used to be in the Netherlands as well, but there it was known as Tandy. So the fact that this device here has Radio Shack written onto it pretty much suggests that it's been imported from either the United Kingdom, more likely North America, to Kosovo in the 90s. So that already made me think, well, that it seems to live in this thing that happened after 1989, when a lot of electronics from Western Europe and North America were kind of imported to what used to be the Warsaw Pact or the non-aligned states in communist Yugoslavia as well. But then this thing fascinated me because I found this in Budapest, not in Budapest, where was this? Not in Zagreb, in Belgrade, of course. In Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, where it's in the military museum, presented as a remote explosive activator captured from the Kosovo Liberation Army. Now, the thing is that this thing in itself, as far as I can tell, is just the pager system. So can we go to the next slide? So the pager system by Radio Shack lives in a kind of other environment of the imaginary. And here we see some early advertisements for pagers. It's a slightly different system, of course, because this is a telephone pager. The one that we saw is one that's kind of a closed circuit, right? You can activate the whole thing without a telephone connection. But here we see this, you can reach your babysitter, but can she reach you? The idea of the pager is something that really makes your domestic environment safe. And if we go to the next slide, there's a little video that I also found by Satellite Paging, the company from...
Hello?
These.
Hi, it's Judy. Got a minute?
Sure. Oh, dear, I wanted Jenny to take our satellite beeper today.
Your kids carry beepers?
Sometimes it's a great way to connect my family. When I dial the satellite tone beeper, Jenny knows it's time to call or come home.
Really?
I was at the mall on Saturday. Bill was convinced I'd taken his keys. Sunday, Bill had his digital satellite beeper, the kind that shows you the number you're supposed to call. That really saved the day for Jason, who was miles from home, and so was everyone else. Bill was able to connect, tell Jason to stay put until he got there.
Great!
Connect your family with a satellite tone beeper for as little as $40. Dial 1-800-BEEPER-2 or 1-800-BEEPER-9 in New Jersey. Beepers by Motorola.
So what fascinates me about these early advertisements for the beepers that I found is that most of them seem to focus not even on business use, but on the kind of the very core of kind of intimate family life and security and safety and having everything under control. Yet then the Kosovo Liberation Army context is the opposite, but then it's actually the device, it's just, nothing's changed to the device, right? It's just been put in this different context, and suddenly it is now framed as and perceived as his weapon. And also there, I would argue that a relevant aspect to this, of course, is already, as Nolan Gertz says in his contribution, we've been primed by this thing that these things can become that. Right? If you watch Breaking Bad or older series like the A-Team or MacGyver, all that stuff, again and again and again, there is a suggestion of, okay, these are ordinary domestic things. You can transform them into bombs. You can use these things to do harm. So then what he argues in his contribution there is that there seems to be a kind of nihilistic drive in consumer culture where on the one hand, we're kind of putting all that stuff, we're kind of putting it right there. Look, this is how you can do it. Look, this is where you buy them. And he gives this example. You can often buy drones now at an electronic shop inside an airport, where it then says you can't fly these in the vicinity of the airport. So in a kind of Foucauldian way, if you like, right, by saying it's forbidden, you're actually pushing the idea. And then when it happens, we say, oh yeah, bad people did this. Whereas there seems to be a kind of drive in culture to frame these things already. And in this pager system, there seems to be some of this already, if you like. And can we go back to the PowerPoint once more? If we go to the next slide now here, this is a small work that I made last year in the kind of very, very beginning when the idea for this project started to come about. Now, this idea of the pager that detonates a bomb has been converted or developed into mobile phones that are used at bombs. So just like the Casio watch became a characteristic for terrorist activity in the kind of early 2000s, in more recent years, there was this whole thing around this phone, the Nokia 105, which was suddenly very popular among Islamic State fighters because it was used to make bombs as well. So what I've tried to do in this small piece, you have this dark phone, you can call it, and then instead of a bomb, it makes this smoke machine. So it plays with the idea of the kind of spectacle and the spectacular, maybe connecting to that German army video we saw in the beginning. The other thing it does then, it has this kind of golden element, that is this thyristor. That is the core of Ramzi Youssef's design, so to say. So there is the smoke, the gold, the kind of slickly made black thing. So the kind of perversity of the kind of cult of explosion, which we already see emerging around this TNT game here. I've tried to kind of push it to the limit by using gold and all this kind of and then this kind of spectacular environment that's being created there. So this is kind of a further iteration of both the Casio watch and the Kosovo Liberation Army trigger. And then we have one more device, which is a case study, and that's this here. This is part of it. This is a device that is in the collection of the Imperial War Museum in, I don't think it's actually in London, but in one of the branches in the United Kingdom. And this is an incendiary device. So it's a trigger system that sets off a firebomb. So you could say, oh, it's not an IED, but generally you group these with it. Developed by the Provisional Irish Republican Army in Ireland, Northern Ireland in the 1990s. And this seems to be of quite a different ilk than especially the previous one, namely for the circuit board that's in there. So here we see that there seems to be quite a neat electronics work and also an actual circuit design, if you like. And what struck me in this is that, for me, it immediately made me think of, kind of Nicholas Collins hacking workshops that artists do nowadays, but also then going further back, and that's in the next slide. Something that was really pronounced in the United Kingdom, but also in other parts of Europe in the 80s, 90s, namely DIY electronics culture. And also, if you go further back, of course, radio amateurs. Now, if you look at the biographies of known IED engineers among the provisional Irish Republican Army, we actually see that a lot of them have a background in television repair, all sorts of electrical engineering things, and there seems to be this kind of link also to this sort of scene, because it is exactly at the map list, and you can see the circuit board there on top. I don't know if this is a homemade one actually, but the kind of circuit board, the way it's been neatly made there, it really suggests that this is a kind of skill set that's very much related to this kind of harmless tinkering scene in everyday life, consumerism of the 80s and 90s. And as you can see, the case studies are all from this era. And I've picked them a little bit further back because that's where I kind of locate digital culture as we know it now to really unfold. Like the first Gulf War is one of those key moments in 1991, but in the 80s you already see this, right? This ZX81 Sinclair computer that was one of the first home computer people had, and they started making these robots connected to it, etc., etc. So yeah, and then the next image we have in the thing, this is another document, an internal armed forces document from the United Kingdom that is also retrieved from WikiLeaks, which analyzes the military operations and particularly also engagement with IEDs during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And I won't show the actual passages here, but what struck me here is something that relates very much to what Erik Kluitenberg says in his contribution in the video, right? Because what he argues is that these IEDs are unruly reappropriations of these everyday objects, that kind of withdraw them from what Mumford then called, this calls the idea of mega machines, so where society and particularly armed forces operate as these kind of large machines of disciplined bodies, that these IEDs kind of slip out of that and then start to disrupt that mega machine. But if we look at the Provisional Irish Republican Army, it becomes a little bit more ambiguous, because actually what we see in a document like this is that often that guerrilla movement was highly organized, and they actually had really kind of R&D programs even, and standardized IED models, like the little thing that I showed before, this case study. There are all sorts of iterations of it, and they all look very, very similar. So here we see that there seems to have been an almost institutionalized IED production culture among the Provisional IRA. We see similar things also with, for example, Hamas or Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip, where there are these designs for rockets that are reiterated. So what does that mean then? There's a kind of a parallel mini mega machine, maybe even, I don't know. So yeah, so those are the three kind of case study things from which which are kind of provocations, if you like, to take this project further. It was a quite long introduction, but this is it. I hope it wasn't too boring.
Do you also see method used in a similar way, or even the same schematics in, let's say, Northern Ireland and the Gaza Strip, or?
Well, I've been looking at some of the actual device, the actual artifacts. And I mean, of course, they're actually technologically, they're kind of simple in a way, right? This is not really advanced stuff, but you can see that there are certain, there's certain characteristic like that C106T thyristor, which is then a thing that kind of started to spread. And then people know, oh, if it's that component, then it's probably someone who comes from the tradition, you could almost say, of Ramzi Youssef's thing. And it's similar with the provisional IRA thing. There has been an issue, I think this is a while ago, it's about 15 years ago or so, that a former or actual member of, I don't even know, it was the provisional IRA, maybe it was the real IRA, was apprehended in the West Bank, and there were worries that this person was actually transferring knowledge about explosives and improvised explosives there. So, and I think that that's actually, it's an interesting question, because on the one hand, these things exist just in a kind of globalized technoculture, right? They're all the same chips, they're all exactly the same watch. So to an extent, they kind of form a banal extension of that. Yet then there are certain local variations. One thing has to do also, of course, with just the way these explosives are situated in relation to bodies. In a very crude sense, suicide bombers use a different technology than, for example, bombers from the IRA. One of the things that the IRA has done is the Margaret Thatcher bombing in Brighton. They used a video recorder, which you can program a month in advance, to already set off the explosive load weeks before she was actually going to be in there. And that's a particular kind of design that is really situated in that kind of cultural environment, right? Very strict security controls, but also a very organized environment. You just book a room, you know where Margaret Thatcher is going to stay because the suite is there, etc., which would be very different if you do IEDs in a war context like Afghanistan, where things are continuously fluid and dynamic, and you need to be chaotic in order not to be apprehended also in the placement and the actual technical aspects of the device. But then again, this is not this you can look into this forever, right? But my interest for me, this project is not a kind of counter-terrorist technical investigation. It is much more, again, what does that tell us? The way that the provisional IRA has modified a video recorder, and how that's perceived in the media, how people experience that. What does that tell us about what we could call the mainstream, or the mainstreaming, if we use the verb in Yasmin Ibrahim's words, of these everyday technologies? Yeah, what
we could quickly look if there are some questions from the audience.
Oh, yeah. And there's, of course, also the question. Oh, there's an audience member called Fucker. Oh.
There's for Anushka, who raised her hand. I don't know if you. I don't know if that means you have a question for now. We opened cam for you, but you're still muted, so.
And invisible.
Well,
we can just open that. Maybe in the meantime, we can just look forward and see, or look ahead and see what's going to happen now. Because this is just a short intro, if you like, of the project.
We're back at recording. That's
okay.
Good to know. But let's, Anushka, if you end up with a question, feel free to hop in. But let's continue indeed to the slideshow.
Yes. All right. I think there's only a last. There's only this. This is the last slide looking ahead. I mean, this actually also looks to the past, or it looks maybe at a kind of a more or less a static element. This is close to where I grew up, in the province of Zeeland in the southwest of the Netherlands, one of the strongholds of the Atlantic Wall. And this is a German bunker that is still there, and it will probably be there for the foreseeable very long future. And as I already indicated before, this is another context that I am interested in relation to these improvised explosive devices with everyday digital artifacts. Namely, when we go back to Paul Virilio and his writing about these bunkers, he grew up at the Atlantic Wall in France. So he saw pretty much similar structures as what I saw when I grew up, just much earlier, just after the war. He writes about these bunkers, as I said already, as a kind of sign of the time. And what he is interested in is that, on the one hand, they are a demarcation of a landline, so there is very much relevance of territory. But at the same time, they also show that this was in an era of air bombardments. So the bunker is actually floating. It doesn't have a real foundation, because if you bomb close to it or on it, it needs to be able to wobble, if you like. So for Virilio, aspects like this are really a sign of, like, look, this is how, this is the relationship to space that was at that moment current. And then if you're familiar with Virilio, his interest is that space and time start to contract there, because if you think about the airplane, it moves very fast, but also there we see a conflation between the speed of the weapon and the speed of the military vehicle, if you like. So it all becomes one, and space becomes, in a way, almost synonymous with time. So then if we go to now, these bunkers, this kind of structures have become more or less irrelevant. Right? If there would be a conflict now, it would not be much point of putting this up, because warfare operates in a much more floating way through technological devices as well. Because you actually go over the bunker, you go on the way, and you actually operate through digital systems. So what I'm interested in then is, if this was this kind of sign of the time, the 1940s, and the atomic bomb was arguably the sign of the Cold War, these IEDs seem to be very much kind of signature technologies that say something about the world we live in now. And Erik Kluitenberg in the documentary already gives a kind of hint at this, of what this might be. He argues, if we look at military organizations as this mega war machine, we now see in recent decades, since the first Gulf War in the 1990s, that there seems to be a drive towards getting bodies completely out of this whole thing and go to a purely technological mode of warfare. And Grégoire Chamaillou, who wrote this book Drone Theory, he also refers to that, and he argues that one of the relevant aspects of drone warfare is not just that the boundaries between civilian space and military space, so the battleground stuff, start to blur. That's an important thing that we all talk about. Another important thing, he says, that with drone warfare, you no longer need soldiers, and that seems really nice, which in a way you could maybe, but the aspect of that is also that the ruling classes are no longer dependent on the working classes or the non-capitalists, if we put it in a Marxist sense. They're no longer dependent on them to wage their wars and to protect their interests. So Chamaillou even argues, he goes as far and says the welfare state that was installed in Western Europe and North America after the Second World War has to do with the willingness to sacrifice of the people who benefit from the welfare state. Now, when these bodies are completely out, you don't need to make any such compromises anymore. So if we then think of these IEDs as these kind of perverse instruments that bring us right back to this element of the flesh, and as Jasmine Ibrahim puts it, and these spaces that are considered completely secure, but completely secure also means completely secure in that the hierarchical divisions of wealth and access to services and stuff are completely fixed and immobile, that these IEDs, they start to undermine that, or they bring a certain kind of uncertainty what we have with terrorism anyway. And that's not to say that, oh, so therefore IEDs are good, right? That is shouldn't be misunderstood. And it's also not, as Jasmine Ibrahim says as well, there's no romance to this, right? It's not like, oh my God, it's fantastic that people do this, but it is something that may be a response to another kind of rigid cultural thing that's happening. So that the peacefulness of our everyday life with these seemingly peaceful devices is an illusion already, of course. Like the coltan in our microchips comes from a violent environment. And these IEDs might kind of, through a kind of dialectical thing in the very tail end of these devices, bring that sort of violence back to the cleansed environments that we exist in.
Yes, that's. I noticed we had some remarks or questions. Can you read them from here?
Yes, I
Yeah.
can. Fucker says to everyone, rest in peace, Sir Clive. And okay, that's a comment, I think.
Yeah.
And now Anushka notes, interesting to know and see how bombs can be activated, including via mobile phones and watches. A lot of information that I have to process at ease. Thank you for the opportunity to attend this performance. Oh, well, you're most welcome. Thank you for this comment. And here is a comment from Stellark, or a question. I see a question mark in the end. Hi, Dani, really interesting. Can you speak more of the problematics of unintended use of technologies given individual human malevolence and the increasing polarization of politics and power? Do we accept that unexpected uses and hacks will always be an issue with any technology? I think that's a really good point. I think the first thing is, if we just start saying, okay, we shouldn't sell anything anymore that can be used to produce IEDs, then we get into quite a grim scenario where a lot of stuff won't be accessible anymore, but also that can be done, and that is done with other political motivations in mind. And a really good example is the dual-use product list that is at the moment used in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. There are a lot of products that are on a dual use, and dual use means you can use it for good and for bad, like fertilizer, for example. These things are put, there's an enormous list of these things that are all not being allowed to be important in the Gaza Strip. So it also means that this kind of idea of IED threat or whatever can be used to install an aggressive politics of de-development, which is actually actively being used now in the Gaza. But you can always use this argument. So I think you could say that could be a way forward. But the question is then, do we accept that unexpected uses and hacks will always be an issue with any technology? I don't think we should accept that these will always be, it can always be done, but I think there is an issue about culture and the way in which these technologies are represented and featured. And that goes to what Nolan Gertz was talking about, right? What does it mean that there seems to be a whole culture around showing all the time that these things can be that? And I think if we put it in another context, in the United States, there are a lot of people who get killed because people own guns. But it's not just that, right? Because every Swiss family has an assault rifle at home as well. Yet we don't hear about a lot of mass shootings and whatever there. There is also a cultural dimension to it. When you give people guns and you also promote a certain thing of there is threat everywhere, you have the gun to protect yourself, the likelihood of these things being adapted in that kind of directions are bigger. So I think for me, this is an issue. On the other hand, I would also perversely say, and maybe I wouldn't say exactly improvised explosive devices, but the fact that a lot of stuff we live with has the possibility to constitute resistance, forceful resistance, is in itself not a bad thing, as long as there is a decent threshold. If we put it in a Marxist sense, if conditions for the working classes deteriorate to a certain unbearable point, revolution will erupt. Starting to promote a thing that nothing can be used anymore to disrupt the official networks of power also means that you are trying to push back, in my opinion, that sort of threshold. So, and of course, this is a touchy thing, right? But I think we should be very conscious of the possibilities of these technologies, and also of what it means to make a TV program that promotes this sort of course, spectacularizes that sort of stuff. So I don't know if that's it's not really acceptance, I would say, but an awareness. The next question is Marxus. Would you say that this research or your work generally is directed to wake the Westerns to a world outside the Western bubble? Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if I would call it a Western bubble, but I would what I am interested in, what my prime interest is with this work, also the work with waste, the work with intimacy and sex, is to draw attention to those things that we take for granted in technological culture, and those things that are therefore also shaping the way we think about the world around us. In other words, the way in which I would argue a lot of these objects instill a latent acceptance of consumer capitalism as the end of history and the only kind of solution into us. So by showing all these kind of things, I'm trying to disrupt that dream of any technology as intrinsically good and la 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 la. So yeah, I would say yes, in a way. The IED seems more effective as an idea threat than the actual device, says Giel. It depends a bit on which IEDs, but I would say in general, if we think about the IED in terms of terrorism, then that is, I would almost say, always the case. The terrorist act and the kind of disruption that you might pursue with an IED in this context, but of course that's not the only one, right? This is a thing that in the artistic part of the project we will explore as well. And in a way you could argue that this is a bit that as well, right? An IED, an improvised explosive device, doesn't necessarily mean that you're gonna like blow up people and kill them. You could even say that a fireworks show is also IEDs. But the idea of the IED, that was also with the provisional IRA, the idea that an improvised explosive device could blow up anywhere, anytime, had a lot bigger impact than the actual explosion in itself. Actually, the ideal often, I would argue, for a lot of the IRA actions was to not harm innocent people, but to kind of instill a culture of fear and threat that would then move towards political negotiation or political compromises. Yeah, so whereas, I mean, there are of course IEDs that are very good, but I mean, I think the question is also effective. What do we mean by that? Yeah. So. What about counter IED tech? This is an interesting question when we look at that operation, the Operation Banner document that actually talks about that quite at length. That, and it's a bit actually when we look in cybercrime, right? That the people who work in counter hacking initiatives often are doing the same thing as people who are doing the hacking. And we saw that also in this first video fragment I showed. That's actually a counter IED. That is actually the counter IED initiative there. So they're actually building the IED as well. So I don't know, like what about counter IED? I don't know really what to respond to that, but one aspect of it is that counter IED technology is very much about actually putting yourself in the position of somebody who lives outside the system and creating these devices then. And then what you see in the kind of provisional IRA versus British Armed Forces relationship is that's kind of a cat and mouse thing, right? The other party wants to think ahead, and you think ahead one step further, if you like. What is your relationship with warfare? How does it relate to intimacy? And another one, in Pakistan, officials move about in a radio jam bubble. What is your relationship with warfare and how does it relate to intimacy? What I meant by that, I look at technological devices, everyday technologies in extreme circumstances, i.e. warfare, waste, and intimacy, is that not that I say there is a relationship directly between warfare and intimacy. There might be, but that's not really what I'm dealing with. I am interested in the places or circumstances in which the meanings and taken for granted aspects of these devices start to crack up. And that might happen when you use a fancy Philips toothbrush to masturbate. It might also happen if you use a Casio watch to build a bomb. So there's that. Having said that, if we follow, and that's what Jasmine Ibrahim has expressed interest in the little interview we did with her, she argues that the IED is very intimate because there is this direct relationship to the flesh, right? In it all its kind of perversity. There is an imaginary of the fleshiness, and it is violent, but it's also in a way intimate, but not intimate in terms of pleasant intimacy of sexuality necessarily. In Pakistan, officials move about in a radio-jammed bubble. Yes, there is all sorts of aspects of that, which has to do also with counter-IED strategies, because now there is the issue of drones. So you actually want a radio jam, so the GPS signals can't reach any potential malevolent drone attacks, so the drone becomes uncontrollable. There is another aspect slightly related to IEDs and to this realm that I'm interested in as well, but not for this project, which is the use of mobile FM transmitters and innovations in that direction that are used in Pakistan by Taliban factions. They move around, they have these mobile FM transmitters, and they broadcast these radio programs for propaganda, which is a very important instrument of warfare for them, if you like. So there is that aspect as well, that also these technological innovations in the realm of malevolent innovation might also branch out to that sort of stuff.
Well, we reached the hour mark of the present.
Okay.
So we could either see if there are more questions from the audience,
or anybody who wants to come and chat live. I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good thing, Richard, to open up the floor to everybody who's still around.
Everybody's allowed to talk now, but you don't have to.
No.
Oh, there's only a few people around. Okay, but also we will slowly, maybe slowly say goodbye to you. But then if anybody wants to come in.
The thing that's good to mention is that we made a project website, destructivecircuits.v2.nl, in which all of the research will be published. There are some steps that you sketched out as possible dates, the first week of November to have an additional iteration, and the summer of 2022.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So actually, but we already fixed the dates, right? 8 till 12 November.
Yeah.
But that will be communicated later on. And the website, at the moment, it's under development. There is, the video is there. The video I've just showed you. I don't know if we can put up the website somewhere in the chat box, maybe. I don't know. But otherwise, maybe send it out later on.
Yeah.
Anyway, at the moment, the website is still quite empty. There is just the video, but what it will have is a repository of sources. So some of the things I've showed you today, those WikiLeaks documents, all sorts of notes on designs and histories of these devices, contextual stuff. It will also have process documents. So I'm planning to put on the longer full interviews with the three academics there, and also the things that will happen in V2 8 till 12 November then, hopefully. What is it, Florian?
It's destructivecircuits.v2.nl.
And destructive minus circuits, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Destructive minus destructive, yes, that's it. That's right. Destructive minus. That's the streepje. That's the minus sign. Yeah. Minus devices. Circuits. Oh my God. Professional.
Circuits.v2.nl.
Yeah, I think that's it. Who knows? Is that a link that works? Well, it's fine. You can figure it out.
Yeah. And we'll update it via our archive as well if you have trouble finding it. So then, in that case, it leaves me to thank you all for joining in on this sunny Sunday here in the Netherlands. And Dani, of course, for being with us. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the rest of the project.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.